Good evening, dear friends, and welcome. Tonight's tale is a killer among the Christmas guests, a mystery woven with snow, candlelight, and secrets. Picture the hearth glowing, tea steaming, and distant bells chiming. Christmas promises warmth, yet shadows stir. The village of St. Mildred's had not known such festivity in years. Greystone Hall blazed with lamplight, its walls dressed in holly and ivy, while carols drifted like snowflakes through the air. Guests gathered by the hearth, their laughter warm, yet their whispers hinted at secrets too fragile for daylight. Beneath polished smiles, old quarrels stirred, and in the servants' hall an absence raised uneasy questions. When midnight bells tolled, merriment turned to horror, a guest lay lifeless, joy extinguished. Who among them bore such malice? Only Miss Marple, serene with her knitting, would unravel the darkness hidden in their midst. Chapter 1. Carols Beneath the Snow. The first snow of Christmas week lay soft across the village lanes, cloaking cottages in a powdery hush that seemed almost sacred. Yet within that hush, the air was alive with anticipation. Greystone Hall had opened its doors for a Christmas celebration of unusual grandeur, and villagers of every stripe were preparing to attend. Few occasions drew such excitement, and none so glittering as the Christmas gathering under the hostess's watchful eye. Candles were promised in every window, mulled wine in generous supply, and music to remind even the most burdened heart of childhood carols. Miss Marple, for her part, would have been perfectly content to spend the evening before her own hearth, knitting in peace and listening to the wind whistle past her neat little garden gate. But she had received a kindly worded invitation, pressed upon her by the hostess herself, who declared that no village gathering was complete without Miss Marple's presence. With gentle courtesy, she accepted. A Christmas party, after all, was as much an opportunity to observe as it was to celebrate, and observation was something Miss Marple never neglected. The lane leading to Greystone Hall glowed with lanterns as carriages and motor cars alike made their way across the snow. At the churchyard corner, Mrs. Penrose, the vicar's wife, could be overheard whispering that she had seen the young nephew, Mr. Henry, looking quite flushed and impatient. "Eager as a fox about the hen-house," she remarked to her companion, her voice muffled in wool. "All inheritance talk and no Christmas cheer, I'd wager." The remark was met with a brisk nod and the quiet suggestion that money has a way of souring even the most festive spirit. Closer to the hall itself, the widow Mrs. Chataway made her entrance in fur-trimmed cloak and crimson hat, a vision of gaiety against the frosted night. She greeted everyone with the warmth of old acquaintance, though her words ran a touch too free. "My dears," she said, "have you heard about the debts Mr. Linton never settled before his passing? Terrible business, simply terrible, though of course his heirs pretend otherwise." Her listeners smiled politely, but there was unease beneath their nods. Mrs. Chataway had a way of turning tidings sour, like cream left too long in the jug. Inside Greystone Hall, the warmth struck immediately. The glow of candles, the scent of evergreen boughs, the golden gleam of polished oak floors. Servants in crisp uniforms bore trays laden with spiced seed cake, steaming mulled wine, and delicate mince pies. The sound of carols, sung by the children of the village choir, drifted from the drawing-room, mingling with laughter and the low rumble of voices. The Christmas spirit seemed to shine from every garlanded corner. Yet beneath it all ran a curious current. To the watchful eye, and Miss Marple's eyes were always so, There were glances held a little too long, laughter that carried a hollow ring, and smiles that faltered when a name was mentioned. The nephew, Henry, circled the hostess with restless energy, his cheer too rehearsed, his gaze too calculating. Mrs. Chataway spread herself amongst the groups, sowing gossip with the delight of a gardener scattering seeds. And more than one villager remarked upon old Mr. Weatherby's absence, though whether from frailty or from reluctance, none could say. Miss Marple moved quietly through it all, a figure of calm with her lace collar and simple gray shawl. She spoke gently to the children, admired the choir's bravery in the cold, and listened, always listened, to the fragments of conversation that wove themselves into patterns others missed. For patterns, she knew, were as revealing as fingerprints. Near the great hearth, as the clock chimed the half-hour, Miss Marple paused. The glow of firelight caught the sparkle of crystal glasses, the sheen of polished silver, the frosted edges of holly wreaths. And in that moment of festive cheer, she heard it, a low voice, hushed but unmistakable, carried on the murmur of the crowd. "Mark my words," the speaker said, "one of them will not see the new year." The words, soft as falling snow, struck colder than the storm outside. The warmth of Greystone Hall was like stepping into another world, a blaze of holly-red ribbons, gilded sconces, and polished silver that caught the gleam of firelight. The great drawing-room brimmed with voices, the clink of glasses, and the faint sweetness of cinnamon and cloves rising from cups of mulled wine. Yet for all its outward cheer, there was a tautness in the air, like a string drawn a fraction too tight. At the center of it all stood Lady Eustace, the hostess. Tall, gracious, and finely dressed in pale silk, she welcomed each guest with practiced warmth. But Miss Marple, standing quietly by the hearth, noticed the faint strain behind her smile, the flicker of weariness in her eyes. Her hand lingered a moment too long on a guest's arm, her laugh carried the faintest edge. She was playing her part admirably, yet she carried some private burden that weighed heavily upon her. The guests, meanwhile, bustled and mingled, their conversations overlapping like the rise and fall of a tide. Henry, the ambitious nephew, was everywhere at once, too loud in his laughter, too bright in his praise, as though determined to dazzle away the whispers that trailed him. The widow Mrs. Chataway flitted through the room with a glass in hand, her voice carrying notes of gossip wherever she alighted. A gentleman newly arrived from London, introduced as Mr. Redfern, stood apart, his eyes moving keenly from one guest to another with a wariness that did not fit the holiday spirit. Miss Marple's sharp ear caught the way conversations faltered at certain names. When mention was made of debts owed, Mr. Linton's family grew suddenly intent on their mince pies. When the subject of inheritance arose, Henry's eyes darted to Lady Eustace with almost predatory interest. Even the vicar, normally so steady, stumbled over his words when asked about the recent church accounts. These were little things, perhaps, but Miss Marple knew that human nature revealed itself in such details, and details were often more telling than confessions. Beyond the tall windows, snow had begun to fall in earnest. It drifted thick and fast, clinging to the glass, muffling the world beyond. The storm gathered strength, swallowing the garden paths and choking the lanes. Guests spoke of it with laughter. How picturesque, how seasonable, but beneath their merriment lay the unspoken knowledge. No one would be leaving Greystone Hall tonight. The house, for all its splendor, had become a snow-bound island. Miss Marple, ever unobtrusive, settled herself in a corner chair, knitting needles moving silently in her lap. From there she watched, the widow leaning too close to Mr. Redfern, Henry whispering urgently to a footman, Lady Eustace's gaze sweeping the room with restless calculation. Patterns emerged as surely as stitches in wool. As the evening drew on, carols gave way to card games, and wine softened voices into laughter, sometimes genuine, sometimes hollow. The great clock in the hall began its slow toll toward 10, its chimes echoing faintly above the merriment. Miss Marple felt the air grow heavier, as though the house itself waited. Then, just as the 10th chime faded, she noticed movement in the corridor beyond the drawing-room. A young maid hurried past, her apron askew, her face streaked with tears. She pressed a handkerchief to her mouth, but her sobs could not be stifled. In that moment, the gaiety of Greystone Hall seemed to falter, and Miss Marple knew that the night's uneasy welcome was only the beginning of darker revelations. Chapter 2. Whispers by the Hearth. The hush that followed the maid's hurried retreat seemed to linger, even as laughter and music swelled again within the drawing-room. Miss Marple, her eyes gentler than most, slipped quietly into the corridor. There, by a side table where evergreen boughs trailed their scent of pine, she found the girl, apron rumpled and face blotched from weeping. "My dear," Miss Marple said softly, laying a comforting hand upon her arm, "it does no good to carry such a burden alone. Tears, after all, seldom fall without cause." The maid, barely more than 17, shook her head at first, terrified of speaking. Yet Miss Marple's patient silence drew words from her as surely as the tide draws pebbles from the shore. I shouldn't have heard it," she stammered. "It wasn't meant for my ears. But they were quarreling, fierce as anything, in the library just before supper. And the things they said—" Her voice broke, and she pressed the handkerchief tighter to her lips. Miss Marple did not press for names, only murmured, "Yes, yes, I understand." The girl went on, almost against her will. One spoke of money, of being ruined if the truth came out. The other said something about a will. "It will never be found," they said. "Oh, ma'am, I daren't repeat more. They'd know it was me." Her fear was genuine, and Miss Marple, though her curiosity burned, did not coax her further. Instead, she soothed the girl with a few kind words, advising her to return to the kitchens and occupy herself with work. People often spoke more freely when they thought their confidences safely hidden. It was only a matter of listening for them to surface again. Back in the drawing-room, gossip had already begun to circulate, carried as easily as smoke from the hearth. Mrs. Chataway, red-faced from wine, whispered of a long-forgotten affair between two guests, shocking, positively shocking, while another muttered about debts unpaid and creditors closing in. There was talk of a missing will, too, and how its discovery might alter the fortunes of several seated so cheerfully at Lady Eustace's table. It was Christmas, yet their whispers were of anything but goodwill. Miss Marple took her seat near the fire, her knitting needles moving rhythmically. She listened as threads of rumor wove themselves into a fabric of suspicion. Henry, the nephew, leaned a little too close whenever inheritance was mentioned, his eagerness barely contained. Mr. Redfern, the London guest, sat with a stillness that suggested not disinterest but calculation. The vicar coughed too sharply when the subject of scandal arose, as though to silence his own name before it could be spoken. It was not merely the words that mattered, Miss Marple reflected, but who heard them and how. The widow's eyes darted constantly, drinking in gossip with the thirst of one who lived upon it. The hostess smiled and nodded, though her hand gripped the back of a chair as though steadying herself against some invisible weight. Human nature, Miss Marple mused, is most clearly seen when it believes itself concealed. The hearth crackled, logs shifting with a sudden spark. Guests leaned closer, faces lit by the golden glow, shadows dancing on the walls. The storm outside rattled at the windows, and the wind moaned down the chimneys. Within, the air was thick with secrets. Then, without warning, a candle guttered on the mantelpiece and went out, plunging half the room into shadow. Before anyone could remark upon it, a sharp cry split the air, echoing from the hall beyond. Laughter ceased, conversation stilled, and all eyes turned toward the darkness at the doorway. Someone, had broken the fragile surface of festivity, and unease deepened into dread. The library at Greystone Hall had always been a place of refuge, a sanctuary of polished oak, leather-bound volumes, and the comforting scent of old paper. But that evening it became the heart of terror. A cry rang out, sharp and shrill, summoning guests from drawing-room and corridor alike. When they arrived, they found Mr. Latham, the solicitor with his smudged cuffs, collapsed across the hearthrug, his face ashen, his breath ragged. A wineglass, half drained, lay overturned beside him. For a moment the room spun with confusion. Lady Chiswick gasped and pressed a hand to her throat. The widow swooned theatrically, requiring the assistance of two gentlemen to lower her into a chair. The ambitious nephew muttered something about foul play, his voice trembling more with eagerness than fear. Servants fluttered at the doorway, whispering in tones that carried more speculation than concern. It was Miss Marple, of course, who retained her composure. Moving gently but with quiet assurance, she knelt beside Mr. Latham, felt for a pulse, and declared, in her firm but unhurried way, "He is not gone. Fetch water, quickly. And do open a window. The air in here is close." A decanter was thrust forward, and a servant hastened with a damp cloth. The old solicitor stirred faintly, his lips moving in a whisper none could catch. Miss Marple, untroubled by the bustle, laid the cloth across his brow and waited, watching not only him but the faces around her. What she saw was telling. Some guests were visibly shaken, the hostess wringing her hands, the housekeeper murmuring prayers. Yet others were curiously still, their eyes fixed not on the victim but on one another. The vicar, normally quick with words of comfort, stood rooted, his jaw tight. The widow, her earlier swoon forgotten, peered keenly at the fallen glass. The nephew's glance darted nervously toward the sideboard, as though measuring escape. Mr. Latham's condition, though dire, began to stabilize. He opened his eyes, bleary with pain, and managed a faint groan before sinking back into silence. Lady Chiswick, her voice unsteady, declared the celebration ruined and begged someone to summon the constable. But the storm howled beyond the shuttered windows. No one would reach the village until morning. In the uneasy lull that followed, Miss Marple's keen gaze fell upon a detail others had overlooked. On the solicitor's napkin, crumpled by his inert hand, a single word had been scrawled in shaky letters. She smoothed the linen, holding it up to the light. The word, though faint, was plain enough to read. "Forgiven." The guests crowded round, whispering in tones edged with fear and fascination. Was it a plea, a confession, a message left in haste? Who had been forgiven, and for what? Miss Marple folded the napkin carefully, tucking it into her pocket with a look that betrayed nothing. Around her, the drawing-room filled with a rising hum of panic, speculation, and thinly veiled suspicion. Outside, the storm lashed harder against the tall windows, as though echoing the storm now brewing within the walls of Greystone Hall. But Miss Marple, serene as ever, simply resumed her seat near the fire, her needles clicking softly once more. She knew that such a word, chosen in extremity, would prove far more dangerous and far more revealing than any glass of poisoned wine. Chapter 3. The Nephew in Question. The cry that had startled the gathering was soon explained. A guest stumbling in the darkened hall, nothing more sinister, or so it was claimed. Yet once unease has touched a company, it lingers, like a chill draught under the door. And as the evening wore on, suspicion found its first target. It was Henry, the hostess's nephew, who drew the eyes of many. His eagerness to be noticed, once dismissed as youthful vanity, now seemed uncomfortably sharp. He laughed too loudly, spoke too quickly, and when the talk turned, as it inevitably did, to matters of property and inheritance, his face betrayed a flicker of avarice that no gaiety could disguise. By the hearth, whispers stirred like embers. Villagers recalled that Henry had long depended upon his aunt's generosity. Some said she had threatened to reduce his allowance, others that she intended to change her will entirely. Such rumors gained weight in the flicker of firelight, whispered by Mrs. Chataway with relish and repeated by others who had overheard nothing but dearly loved the sharing of scandal. Miss Marple, seated quietly with her knitting on her lap, remembered the supper table. She recalled how Henry's fork had struck his plate with unusual force when his aunt, Lady Eustace, had praised another guest's accomplishments. She remembered the faint tightening of his jaw when money was mentioned, the glance he cast at the butler as though confirming something privately arranged. Such details were trifles, yet in Miss Marple's experience, trifles often carried the weight of truth. The gossip soon grew louder than the carols sung in the adjoining room. "It must be Henry," one woman whispered. "He has the most to gain. Didn't you see the way he hovered about Lady Eustace?" said another. "As if he would pluck the will from her pocket if he could." Even the vicar, normally restrained, murmured that young men without steady employment too often found themselves tempted by darker means. Henry himself seemed aware of the attention. He flushed under scrutiny, grew brusque in speech, and attempted to charm the company with stories of London life. But his laughter fell flat, and his eagerness only deepened the impression that he was concealing desperation. He was, Miss Marple reflected, too conscious of how he appeared, always a dangerous sign. The storm outside pressed heavily against the tall windows, muffling the world in whiteness. Within, the drawing-room grew hotter with fire and wine, yet colder in spirit. Lady Eustace did her best to dispel the mood, urging the choir to sing again, passing plates of sugared almonds, laughing more heartily than before. But the strain showed. Her eyes lingered too long upon her nephew, and when she raised her glass in a toast, her hand trembled ever so slightly. Miss Marple observed it all, storing each impression as neatly as the stitches on her needles. Yet she did not allow herself to reach a conclusion too quickly. People, she knew, often behaved guiltily without being guilty at all. The night pressed on. As servants cleared the table, one of them returned with a queer expression. In his hands he held an empty wine-glass, its rim smeared, its absence previously unremarked. It had been discovered outside, half buried in the snow beneath the library window. A murmur spread through the room, more chilling than the storm itself. Someone had carried it there, someone with something to hide. The discovery of the missing glass had the effect of a thunderclap. Though the snowstorm outside muffled sound, the drawing-room hummed with speculation and fearful certainty. Fingers pointed quickly, as fingers often do when fear seeks an outlet. And nearly every finger turned toward Henry. "He's the one," Mrs. Chataway declared in a tone of triumph rather than sorrow. "Didn't I say as much? The glass proves it. He must have slipped out into the snow after quarrelling with Lady Eustace." Others agreed readily. The vicar coughed gravely, declaring that temptation was strongest for those with much to gain. And Mr. Tilling, whose gouty foot kept him by the fire, proclaimed that no jury in the land would need more evidence. A young man, desperate for money, an ill-tempered exchange at supper, and now the telltale trail of a discarded glass. It was all too neat, too pat. Miss Marple, sitting quietly with her needles gleaming in the firelight, lifted her head with the faintest smile. "I should not be so quick to condemn if I were you," she said gently. Her voice was soft, but it carried across the heated room. "In my experience, dear friends, it is the obvious suspect who proves the least likely. Real criminals, you see, rarely stand so directly in the open." The company shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Chataway pursed her lips, but did not immediately reply. Henry himself, crimson with indignation, protested loudly. "You see, even Miss Marple says it. I've done nothing, nothing at all. Why should I bury a glass in the snow? I've not left this house all evening." Yet his very eagerness to seize upon her defence did him little good. The villagers eyed him with suspicion still, and Lady Eustace, though she attempted a smile, seemed pale beneath her powdered cheeks. Miss Marple, meanwhile, pursued her thought aloud, as if speaking to herself. "One must consider the time, you see. The quarrel, if there was one, happened before the singing of carols, and the glass appears to have been carried outside after supper. A curious gap, is it not? For if Mr. Henry had indeed acted upon impulse, he would not likely have waited so long." The vicar frowned, tugging at his sleeve. "Then you suggest the glass was placed there later, by another hand?" "I only suggest," said Miss Marple mildly, "that human nature is very fond of arranging appearances, and appearances, alas, so seldom reflect the truth." The storm rattled against the windows then, as though to underscore her words. Conversation faltered, and a silence stretched uncomfortably long. The company, caught between eagerness to assign blame and unease at Miss Marple's reminder, began to murmur again in lower tones, less certain than before. It was during this hush that the first whisper of smoke was noticed, not from the hearth's cheery blaze, but from a corner of the drawing-room where a widow in black satin sat hunched. Mrs. Redmain, with her heavy veil and restless hands, had been quiet all evening. Yet now she leaned close to the fire, slipping folded sheets swiftly into the flames. The paper curled, blackened, and was gone before any could stop her. But not before the bold scrawl of handwriting had been glimpsed, letters, hastily destroyed, their contents known only to her. "Good heavens!" cried Lady Eustace, half rising from her chair. Miss Marple's eyes, bright and steady, fixed upon the widow's hands. "Now I wonder," she murmured, "why one chooses such a moment to feed the fire." Chapter 4. Letters in the Fire. Gasps circled the drawing-room like a sudden wind through the chimney. All eyes turned upon the black-veiled figure of Mrs. Redmain, her cheeks flushed with the warmth of the fire, or was it something closer to shame? With one gloved hand, she pressed the poker too firmly against the hearth, as if by scattering the embers she might also scatter the suspicions that had already begun to form. Lady Eustace's voice trembled. "My dear Mrs. Redmain, what on earth are you about? Burning papers at such a time? Why, it is most irregular." The widow gave a small, brittle laugh, though her eyes did not rise to meet the company's. "Merely trifles, Lady Eustace. Old letters, nothing more. Sentimental nonsense, not fit for other eyes. Surely a woman has the right to keep her affairs private." "Private affairs, perhaps," said the vicar gravely, "but private flames in the midst of a murder inquiry, well, that is another matter entirely." The company shifted, whispering like restless sparrows. Some believed her explanation readily, for she was, after all, a widow of some years, accustomed to melancholy remembrances. Others, sharper of mind or more inclined to relish scandal, were less convinced. There had been something furtive in the way she bent over the grate, something almost desperate in the haste with which she consigned those folded sheets to the fire. Miss Marple alone seemed entirely calm. She sat in her armchair, her knitting needles clicking softly, her eyes following the widow with quiet intensity. When she spoke, it was in that same gentle tone that so often belied the sharpness of her inquiry. "You must forgive an old woman's curiosity," she said kindly. "But I cannot help wondering, if those were indeed love letters, why destroy them on such a night as this, when all is already so troubled? Would it not have been easier to wait until you were home again, in the safety of your own hearth?" Mrs. Redmain hesitated, her lips parting, then pressing shut again. "It was the moment, that is all," she muttered at last. "A sudden impulse. They weighed upon me, memories I wished to forget." Miss Marple inclined her head as though in sympathy. "Yes, I dare say memories may weigh heavily, particularly at Christmastide. And yet—" she allowed the words to trail away, her needles flashing in the lamplight. "There is an oddness in timing. Old letters carry their burden for years. One wonders why the burden should become intolerable only when death has entered the house." The widow's hands trembled, clutching the edge of her shawl. "You twist my meaning, Miss Marple. They were private, that is all. Private and quite unconnected with this dreadful business." But the room was not convinced, nor, it seemed, was Miss Marple. For as the company's attention began to scatter once more, some toward the storm outside, others to Lady Eustace's attempts to rally the spirits, Miss Marple rose quietly from her chair. With the smallest of sighs, she moved to the hearth. Stooping down, she stirred the ashes with the tip of the poker, careful, patient, her face impassive. And there, among the gray remains of charred paper, a fragment had escaped complete destruction. A corner of parchment, scorched at the edges, bore words still visible in a bold, hurried hand. She lifted it delicately with her knitting needle, her eyes narrowing just enough to read. Christmas Eve, settled. The words seemed to whisper into the silence, more chilling than any gust of the storm outside. Whispers clung to the heavy curtains and darkened corners of Greystone Hall as though the storm outside had seeped indoors, carrying secrets with it. Mrs. Redmain sat rigidly by the fire, her veil lowered, her gloved hands twisting in her lap. But no veil could muffle the tide of gossip that now coursed through the room. It began with a murmur from Mrs. Finch, the grocer's wife, who had been permitted entry as a companion to her wealthier cousin. "They say," she hissed to the vicar's wife, "that Mrs. Redmain's late husband did not leave his affairs in order. Gambling debts, whispered about in London clubs. Quite a sum unaccounted for." The vicar's wife pursed her lips. "And I have heard it said," she replied in tones heavy with importance, "that she was once rather too close with a gentleman who was not her husband. A colonel, if I recall correctly, though he disappeared abroad before the matter grew public." As such morsels do, the tale spread swiftly, embroidered with each retelling. Soon the company was casting sidelong glances at the widow, as though her very posture betrayed impropriety. The colonel became a known rake, the debts transformed into fortunes squandered, and the half-burnt letter in the grate seemed to seal the matter with damning ink. Lady Eustace attempted to maintain composure, her hands fluttering as she urged everyone toward the wassail bowl and a fresh round of carols. But her cheer faltered against the growing unease. Shadows pooled in the corners of the hall. The storm beyond the windows pressed like a dark sea against glass. Every gust rattled the panes and made the candles flicker uncertainly. Miss Marple, quiet in her corner, knitted steadily while her eyes moved from face to face. She observed the eager malice with which the villagers dissected Mrs. Redmain's past, and the studied indifference with which others, those with secrets of their own, pretended not to listen. She knew well enough that guilt often found comfort in pointing to guilt elsewhere. The widow herself shifted, her composure fraying. At last she said, her voice brittle, "Yes, there were debts. My late husband was careless with cards. And yes, there was a gentleman who once paid me attentions. But these are ghosts of another life. They have nothing to do with this night, nothing to do with murder." Her denial only deepened the silence. The company stared at her, some with pity, others with suspicion. And though Miss Marple inclined her head kindly, the words "Christmas Eve" settled whispered again in her thoughts, as persistent as the wind at the casement. It was at that moment that young Peter, the stable-boy pressed into service for the evening, burst into the hall, his cheeks pale from the cold. "Beg pardon, ma'am," he stammered to Lady Eustace, "but I found something strange in the cellar." All eyes turned upon him. He held out his lantern, its glass cracked, the flame long extinguished. "It were tipped over among the coal bins," he explained breathlessly, as though someone was down there, searching in the dark. A hush fell upon the company, heavier than the storm outside. Someone had been prowling the hidden places of Greystone Hall, and whatever they sought, they were willing to brave the cellar shadows to find it. Chapter 5. The Secret in the Cellar. The descent into the cellar was like stepping into another world. The merry lamplight of the drawing-room faded behind them, replaced by damp stone walls, the sharp tang of coal dust, and the hollow drip of water seeping through ancient mortar. A small procession of villagers and guests trailed after Lady Eustace's butler, their breath clouding in the chill. Miss Marple, though elderly, insisted on following, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. The overturned lantern still lay where Peter had found it, its wick scorched but extinguished. Beside it, scuffed boot prints led deeper into the shadows. The butler frowned, stooping to trace them with his finger. "Not mine," he said quietly. "Someone else has been down here tonight." They followed the prints until they reached a stout oak trunk, its iron bands rusted, its lock heavy and forbidding. The butler drew back, muttering he had never seen it used in all his years of service. But Lady Eustace, her face pale above her lace collar, admitted it had belonged to her late husband. "Old papers," she said uncertainly. "I had quite forgotten it was there." A murmur rippled through the company, half expectation, half dread. The lock yielded only after much rattling, for the housekeeper discovered, to her mortification, that the key was missing from her ring. It was Miss Marple who observed the faint mark of freshly broken metal at the clasp, as though someone had forced the lock earlier. At last, with the aid of a coal hammer, the lid creaked open, releasing a smell of dust and old parchment. Inside lay bundles of ledgers, tied with faded ribbon, their pages stiff with age. By the light of the lanterns, curious hands turned them open, and gasps followed. Numbers filled the columns, neat but incriminating. Names leapt from the pages, names that belonged not only to the Eustace family, but to several of those present in the hall above. There were loans never repaid, transactions disguised as gifts, signatures that spoke of fraud, collusion, and silent ruin. Mr. Enderby, the solicitor, turned a shade paler than the ledger he held. These are accounts that ought never have seen daylight," he stammered. "Old business arrangements, long forgotten." But his hand trembled, and Miss Marple's eyes caught the fresh ink smudge on his cuff, as though he had been leafing through papers earlier in secret. The widow swayed where she stood, whispering that her late husband's debts might at last be explained. The nephew clenched his jaw, for one ledger bore his name alongside a sum that suggested not inheritance but embezzlement. And the housekeeper wrung her hands, protesting her innocence, though Miss Marple noticed the telltale gap where one key was missing from her ring. The cellar seemed to close in upon them with each revelation, the flicker of lantern light throwing long shadows against the damp walls. Whispers rose into accusations, voices sharpened, and fear laced every glance. It was not merely one among them who might have wished to silence Lady Eustace or to keep secrets buried. It was many. And then, slicing through the quarrel, came a cry from the staircase above. High, sharp, and unmistakably distressed. "Lady Eustace, she's gone." The company froze, ledgers forgotten, as the words echoed down the stone passage. The hostess herself had vanished into the storm-lashed night, or worse, into the darkness within her own house. Panic surged through Greystone Hall like a sudden gale rattling every shutter. The company hurried back up the cellar steps, their lanterns bobbing wildly, hearts thudding faster than the storm outside. Voices called her name, echoing through the drafty corridors. "Lady Eustace! Lady Eustace!" Each unanswered cry tightened the knot of dread. Miss Marple, though slower than the rest, did not hurry. Her small steps were measured, her gaze attentive to every overturned cushion, every door left ajar. Panic, she knew, often left clues unnoticed by those who ran too fast. At last, a shout from the eastern corridor drew them all. There, by the French doors that opened onto the snow-covered terrace, Lady Eustace stood trembling, her shawl half fallen from her shoulders. Her face was as white as the frost clinging to the glass behind her. "Good heavens, my dear!" exclaimed the vicar's wife, rushing forward. "Where have you been?" Lady Eustace clutched at the door-frame for support. I received a note," she whispered. "Slipped beneath my chamber door. It said I was to come at once, that there was news of my late husband's affairs." Her breath caught, and she pressed a hand to her throat. "But when I came, there was nothing, only darkness and the sound of someone retreating down the passage." The hall buzzed with outrage. Who among them would dare such a trick, with suspicion already thick in the air? The nephew muttered about malicious pranks. The widow, still pale from her own ordeal, declared it must be a warning. Yet in the hush that followed, Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly, as though she alone remained unruffled. "It is curious," she remarked gently, "that whoever wrote the note believed Lady Eustace would obey it without question. That suggests knowledge of her vulnerabilities, her fear of scandal, her concern for her husband's affairs." She folded her hands upon her lap. In short, it was not a stranger's doing, but someone who knows her well. The butler, prompted by Miss Marple's quiet direction, produced the note from Lady Eustace's trembling grasp. Its paper was ordinary enough, but the handwriting, tidy, slanted, with a slight flourish to the capital letters, was not. Gasps circled the room as the scrap was held to the lamplight. Mr. Enderby leaned in, peering closely. "I know that hand. It belongs to a man of standing, of education. See the loop on the G, the firmness of the strokes." The widow, her eyes narrowing, whispered, "Surely not." Miss Marple's voice cut through, mild but steady. "Yes, my dear. I fear this hand belongs to one none of us would have thought to question. It is the vicar's." A silence fell as heavy as the storm pressing against the windows. All eyes turned toward the clergyman, who stood frozen, his expression unreadable. The hearth crackled, the wind rattled the panes. And somewhere within that hush, the cozy safety of Greystone Hall seemed to falter, giving way to darker possibilities. For if even the vicar could not be trusted, then who among them truly could? Chapter 6. The Vicar's Puzzle. The vicar's face flushed crimson beneath the scrutiny of the room. For a moment he looked less like a man of the cloth and more like a schoolboy caught in mischief. Yet his voice, when it came, was firm, ringing with the authority of his Sunday sermons. "This is preposterous," he declared, his hands trembling ever so slightly as he gestured toward the incriminating note. "Yes, the letters bear resemblance to my hand, but I did not pen such a message. I swear it before God and my parish." The company murmured uneasily. To accuse a vicar of deceit was no small matter. To hear a man of faith protest his innocence so ardently was equally troubling. Lady Eustace pressed a handkerchief to her lips, her eyes darting between the note and the man who had christened her children. Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting needles clicking softly, as though the rhythm of wool and steel helped order her thoughts. She had lived long enough to know that indignation often served as a cloak, sometimes for innocence, sometimes for guilt. "Forgery is possible, of course," she said gently. "And yet, one must ask, why forge the vicar's hand, of all people? Unless it was thought no one would dare to question it." The vicar seized upon her words eagerly. "Precisely, Miss Marple. A cruel trick to draw suspicion upon me. You all know my character, my devotion to this parish." Yet a thin shadow of doubt lingered. For only hours earlier, during the carol service, the vicar's sermon had touched, curiously, uncomfortably, upon betrayal, forgiveness, and the heavy burden of sin. A theme, Miss Marple reflected, oddly apt for a household simmering with secrets. Was it coincidence, or had his conscience sought a voice in Holy Writ? Around the hearth, the villagers shifted, torn between reverence and suspicion. Mr. Enderby muttered that such sermon topics were most ordinary at Christmastide, while Mrs. Finch whispered that the vicar had grown strangely distracted these past months, given to long walks alone in the churchyard. Miss Marple leaned back, her eyes resting upon the vicar's hands, strong, well-shaped, ink-stained at the fingertips. She thought of the psychology of guilt, how some souls, incapable of concealing their torment, bled it out in sermons or poetry, while others grew still and polished, like marble over a grave. The question was not whether guilt existed in Greystone Hall, but in whose breast it lodged most heavily. Before the matter could be pressed further, the butler entered with a tray of tea to soothe frayed nerves. Cups were passed round, steam curling in the lamplight, the fragrance of bergamot rising like balm. Conversation softened, though suspicion still hummed beneath the surface. Miss Marple lifted her own cup, pausing just as the rim touched her lips. Something, a faint odor, metallic and out of place, pricked her senses. Her blue eyes narrowed. With unassuming calm, she set the cup back upon its saucer. At that precise moment, the nephew, eager for distraction, reached for her tea instead of his own. He raised it to his lips, then sputtered violently, coughing as though fire had seared his throat. The cup fell, shattering upon the polished floorboards, its contents staining the rug. A horrified silence followed. The butler bent, sniffed, and recoiled. "There's something wrong in it, ma'am," he whispered. "Something bitter." Miss Marple's knitting rested still upon her lap. Her gaze moved slowly round the circle of faces, each paling in turn. Someone had tried again, and this time the intended victim had been her. The broken china was quickly swept away, though the bitter tang of the poisoned tea seemed to linger in the air, heavier than the coal smoke drifting from a hearth. The nephew, pale and shaken, sat with a blanket about his shoulders, while the others whispered in fearful tones. The thought that someone among them had meant harm to gentle Miss Marple unsettled them more than the murder itself. But Miss Marple herself remained serene, her hands folded neatly over her knitting bag. "It is of no consequence," she said softly, her voice steady as candlelight. "An old woman such as myself is of little account. But it is revealing, is it not, that our culprit grows impatient." Her words struck deeper than any accusation. Around the table, eyes avoided one another, and even the vicar's normally steady gaze faltered. Outside, the wind hurled sleet against the panes. Inside, the storm of suspicion thickened. When supper was called, an uneasy affair of cold meats and seed cake, few had appetite, though all took their places. Miss Marple insisted upon attending, her presence oddly comforting, as though her very composure tethered the room. The candles guttered in the draughts, shadows bending long across the walls. It was then that Miss Marple began her quiet game. She asked, in her mildest tones, questions that seemed innocent enough but pressed like fingers against a bruise. "Tell me, Mr. Enderby, do you often deal with documents so very old? One wonders how easily a man might lose track of a page or two." And to the widow, love letters are difficult things, are they not? They tend to outlast our intentions. Each query left its mark. The solicitor dabbed his brow with a trembling handkerchief. The widow shifted uneasily, her fork untouched. The nephew muttered half-answers, his gaze fixed on his plate. Even the housekeeper, normally invisible in her duties, blushed and fumbled with the salt-cellar. The table had become an arena of nerves. Every clink of cutlery was magnified, every cough a guilty echo. The guests, trapped by the storm and by their own anxieties, grew restless under the pressure of Miss Marple's calm scrutiny. She needed no harsh words, no raised voice. Her questions, so polite, so reasonable, carried the weight of truth waiting to be uncovered. At length she set aside her fork, her blue eyes moving from face to face. "It grows late," she said, her tone still gentle, though the hush it commanded was absolute. "But I think we may all rest a little easier, for I know who is responsible for what has befallen us here." A collective breath seemed drawn, held tight. The vicar leaned forward, his knuckles whitening on the tablecloth. Lady Eustace gasped softly. Even the storm paused, as if pressing its ear against the ancient stone walls. But Miss Marple only smiled faintly and reached for her knitting. "Tomorrow morning," she continued, "all shall be made clear. Tonight we must sleep, though I fear our culprit may find little rest." And with that, she resumed her needle's steady clicking, while around her, unease rippled like a cold draught beneath the door. The revelation was promised, but the night would be long, and in that span, fear itself might coax the guilty hand into one last fatal mistake. Chapter 7. Christmas Morning Revelation. When morning came, Greystone Hall seemed a different place. The storm had passed, leaving a hard, silver light that made the frost on the panes glitter like spun sugar. Guests drifted into the drawing-room, pale and hollow-eyed from a night of little sleep and many uneasy imaginings. Their faces bore the soft, bewildered look of those who have peered too long into darkness and found it curiously familiar. Miss Marple, however, remained composed, her knitting stilled upon her lap, her blue eyes alert as ever. She invited them to sit, and they obeyed as though in a small, trembling congregation. For a moment there was only the ticking of the old clock and the whisper of footsteps on the stair. Then, in her gentle voice that had the authority of someone used to listening rather than lecturing, she began to speak. "Last night," she said, "we saw many things and heard many things. Bits of gossip and brave declarations, scraps of paper hurried into flames, a glass left in the snow, a lantern overturned in the cellar, ledgers that should have been buried, and, most dangerously, a cup of tea meant to harm. You have all been unsettled, naturally. But facts, like threads, can be woven together." She spoke with the careful patience of a woman examining a tapestry. One by one she named the particulars, the half-burnt scrap that read, "Christmas Eve, settled," the solicitor's smudged cuff suggesting he had handled the ledgers more recently than he admitted, the missing key from the housekeeper's ring implying someone had gone through the trunk before tonight, the vicar's hand used as a frightening disguise on the false note, the maid's tearful confession that she had overheard a quarrel in the library, the tipped lantern in the cellar, as though someone had searched in desperate haste. Each small fact Miss Marple placed before them like pieces of a puzzle. "Observe, too," she went on, "how opportunity and knowledge overlapped. The murderer, or the person who would arrange mischief, required not only motive but the means to move about unseen, someone accustomed to the passages, unnoticed in the night, familiar with where keys and papers are kept, someone who could draw a servant aside and be believed, someone whose grief might be turned to bitterness." Her eyes paused on faces that flushed and paled in turn. A hush settled. Miss Marple's voice grew softer still. She recounted the maid's movements, how she had been close to the serving table, how she had seen the glass carried out, how she had gone to the corridor and overheard that quarrel. She reminded them of the maid's mother's ruin, mentioned in hushed tones by Mrs. Chataway, a misfortune traced in the ledgers they had found. And she spoke of the way the maid had cried, out of fear, she said, but perhaps also out of guilt's younger cousin, grief. The company listened, transfixed and uneasy. Miss Marple's knitting lay in her lap like a small, calm island amid turbulent seas. She folded her hands and looked slowly around the room, her gaze lingering longest on a corner where the quiet maid had been standing since dawn, her fingers clasped so tightly her knuckles showed white. "I do not accuse lightly," Miss Marple said at last, "but the patterns are plain. Our evidence leads us not to the nephew, nor to the widow, nor to the clergyman, but to the maid." She paused, letting the weight of that observation settle among them, then remained silent, her eyes steady and unblinking as always. For a long moment after Miss Marple's quiet words, no one moved. The fire snapped in the grate, sending sparks up the chimney, and the only sound was the faint clink of the chandelier's crystals as a draught stirred them. The maid, little Alice, known for her soft voice and downcast eyes, stood frozen in the corner, her face pale as the snow outside. At last she spoke, her words halting and uneven. "It isn't true, or," she faltered, catching her breath. "No, it is true. It was me. But you cannot know what they did to us." A murmur rippled through the gathering. Mrs. Chataway clutched her pearls. The solicitor shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The widow leaned forward with avid interest. But Miss Marple, serene and unflinching, merely inclined her head, inviting Alice to continue. "My mother," Alice whispered, her voice trembling but growing in strength, "was once respected here. My father trusted these very people. But debts were twisted, papers forged, reputations ruined. And who cared for us then? Not one of you. She was cast aside like rags after a festival, and I, her daughter, learned what it was to be scorned." Her eyes flashed, no longer timid. "So yes, I came to Greystone Hall with purpose. To see their laughter stilled, their arrogance broken. The nephew, the widow, the vicar, the solicitor, all of them, hands dirted by betrayal and greed. And I thought, why should Christmas be merry for them when it was sorrow for us?" The silence that followed was heavy, thick with unease. Some turned away, unable to meet her gaze. Others stared, stricken by the venom in her words. But Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice as soft as falling snow. "My dear," she said gently, "I do not deny your pain. Injustice is a bitter draught, and memory, when fed on bitterness, grows poisonous indeed. But tell me, has vengeance restored your mother's honor? Has it brought you peace?" Alice's lips trembled. For a heartbeat she held Miss Marple's gaze. Then her shoulders sagged as though some great weight had pressed her down. "No," she whispered. "It has only hollowed me out." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her eyes filled not with triumph but with sorrow. "Hatred is a thief, child. It steals the joy of today to repay the sorrows of yesterday. Your youth, your tenderness, all the good you might have done, it has been consumed by this one pursuit. And now look at you, standing among them, yet lonelier than ever." A single sob escaped the maid's throat. She pressed her hands to her face, her body shaking. Words tumbled out between gasps. "I only wanted them to know what it feels like, to fear, to lose, to see everything crumble." The guests shifted uneasily, their guilty consciences pricked. For some, her words struck too close to the truth of their dealings. For others, it was merely the horror of seeing a servant girl transformed into something vengeful and wild. Miss Marple reached out, her voice like balm on a wound. "Then let it end here. No more deceit, no more darkness. The storm has passed, Alice. Let the storm within you pass as well." At that, the girl gave a great, shuddering cry and sank to the floor, her tears soaking into the carpet. The sound of her weeping filled the vast hall as outside the clouds parted, revealing a pale winter sun breaking through the frost. And so, as Christmas morning dawned clear and still, the truth lay bare, not only of a crime, but of a wasted youth undone by sorrow. Yet Miss Marple, ever gentle, knew this was not merely an ending. It was the beginning of reckoning. But what form that reckoning would take, punishment, forgiveness, or something more subtle, remained to be seen. Chapter 8. The Bells of St. Mildred's. By the time the village constable and 2 officers from the county arrived at Greystone Hall, the storm had spent itself. The snow outside lay crisp and unbroken save for the crunch of boots along the gravel path. The guests, gathered once more in the great drawing-room, seemed as pale and spent as the dying embers in the hearth. Their voices, when they dared speak, were hushed, more suited to a funeral than a Christmas gathering. The maid, Alice, sat quietly in a chair near the door, her eyes swollen from weeping, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked very small and very young beneath the stern gaze of the constable, and yet the shadow of her words lingered heavy in the air. When they rose to take her into custody, she did not resist. Instead, she lifted her head, as if resigned at last, and walked with steady, almost solemn steps toward the waiting sleigh that would carry her down to the village jail. The snow crunched softly under her shoes, and the great doors of Greystone Hall shut firmly behind her. A silence followed her departure, broken only by the rustle of skirts and the uneasy clearing of throats. The widow dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, though whether from true sorrow or mere nervousness was unclear. The solicitor busied himself with papers no one had asked him to review. The vicar, looking years older than he had the night before, stood by the window, murmuring something that might have been a prayer. At last, Lady Chiswick, the hostess of the evening, whose own dignity had not faltered even in the face of so much upheaval, rose from her seat and approached Miss Marple. Her voice trembled, yet carried a note of deep sincerity. "Miss Marple," she said, "I owe you more than I can express. Had it not been for your quiet courage, we might all still be dancing in ignorance, or worse, still at risk. You have shown us that evil may creep in silently, even amongst friends and neighbors." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting, her needles clicking softly in her lap. "Oh, my dear lady," she replied, her tone gentle, "it is no courage of mine. One merely observes and remembers. People tell you what you need to know, if only you care to listen." The words settled among the guests, each of whom recalled their own whispered gossip, their careless boasts, their secret fears. For some, shame burned hot on their cheeks. For others, relief came like a cool draught after fever. Yet none could quite shake the knowledge that danger had lurked among them unnoticed, disguised in the face of a familiar servant girl. The fire crackled as though to remind them that warmth and safety were fragile gifts, easily extinguished. Beyond the frosted windows, the bells of St. Mildred's rang out across the snowy fields, solemn and steady, calling the village to morning service. Their tones carried comfort, but also a certain warning that peace, however dearly bought, was never permanent. One by one, the guests excused themselves, some to their chambers, some to make hurried plans to leave as soon as roads were passable. Only Miss Marple remained, seated near the fire, her knitting steady, her expression thoughtful. She did not gloat, nor did she sigh. She merely reflected, as she often did, on the frailty of human nature, the quickness with which joy may turn to bitterness, the ease with which trust may fracture. And as the bells tolled their final notes, fading into the stillness of the morning, Miss Marple sat in the glow of the fire, pondering quietly the strange and sorrowful ways of the human heart. It was not yet the end of the story. Morning came clear and bright, as though the storm of the night before had been but a bad dream. Sunlight struck the snow in dazzling brilliance, turning the meadows and rooftops into a landscape of glittering white. Smoke curled cheerfully from cottage chimneys, and the bells of St. Mildred's rang out once again, this time not with solemn warning, but with their familiar peal of Sunday gladness. The villagers, who had lain awake half the night with whispers and worry, emerged from their houses in twos and threes. The scandal of Greystone Hall was already being retold, softened here, embroidered there, shaped into the kind of tale that could be safely shared over a pot of tea or while queuing at the baker's. Some spoke gravely of Alice, the maid, her tragic misfortune and misguided revenge. Others clucked their tongues, insisting they had long suspected something odd in her manner. Yet even in their gossip there was a note of sympathy. After all, tragedy, when once removed from danger, becomes easier to pity. In the churchyard, the vicar's voice rang firm and steady, though his sermon touched a little more than usual on forgiveness and the danger of letting anger fester. The congregation listened soberly, heads bent against the bright glare of sun on snow. And afterward, as coats were buttoned and hands were warmed at the stove, the air filled again with the cozy chatter of village life. Life, as it always does, was slipping back into its familiar patterns. Meanwhile, at Greystone Hall, Lady Chiswick walked slowly through her house, straightening a candlestick here, smoothing a cushion there, determined that her home would not remain forever shadowed by the memory of that dreadful night. She spoke kindly to her staff, making gentle promises that, in time, things would settle. And indeed, already the hall seemed to breathe again, its walls holding not only secrets, but also the laughter and traditions of generations past. Miss Marple, however, had no desire to linger at Greystone. With the matter concluded and the constable satisfied, she accepted a small basket of scones from Lady Chiswick and made her way homeward. The village lane crunched beneath her sensible shoes, and her scarf fluttered in the crisp air. She looked not like the woman who had unpicked a knot of lies and vengeance, but simply like an elderly gentlewoman returning from a visit. Her cottage welcomed her as always. The kettle whistled, the canary chirped in its cage, and her knitting lay just where she had left it. She settled into her armchair with a sigh of quiet contentment, the rhythm of the needles soothing after so much talk of darker things. Through the window she could see the church spire gleaming, hear the bells echoing over the fields, and smell the faint sweetness of pine from the garland she had hung across the mantel. For Miss Marple knew, as perhaps only she did, that danger may lurk in the most ordinary corners, and that bitterness, if left untended, may grow into tragedy. Yet she also knew that kindness, watchfulness, and simple human decency could heal much. And so she smiled faintly to herself, poured a cup of tea, and let the peace of St. Mary Mead, fragile though it might be, enfold her once more. The bells of St. Mildred's rang on, carrying their promise of comfort and continuity across the snowy countryside. Christmas, after all, had come again, and with it the quiet assurance that life, even shadowed by sorrow, could be restored. And so, dear friends, the Christmas gathering at Greystone Hall concluded not in simple merriment, but in revelation. Miss Marple showed us, once again, that beneath holly and candlelight, human hearts may conceal secrets, some tender, others perilous. Yet, when truth comes to light, shadows disperse, and peace finds its way back to the village lanes of St. Mildred's. I thank you warmly for joining me in tonight's tale, A Killer Among the Christmas Guests. These stories remind us that even the coziest hearth may hide mysteries worth unraveling. Tell me, if you had been among the company at Greystone Hall, what tiny detail might have caught your eye? A glance, a gesture, a missing glass? I would dearly love to hear your thoughts. Until we meet again, may your evenings be filled with the glow of firelight, the comfort of friendship, and perhaps just a whisper of mystery.